Have you ever felt the weight of waiting for someone who never arrived? I did. And it wasn't just any wait. It was at the airport, surrounded by people rushing about, the sound of announcements and echoing footsteps. Everyone had a destination, everyone had someone to meet. Everyone, except me. They promised they would come. They promised they would be there, waiting for me with open arms as it should be. But the promise turned to silence, and the silence turned to hours. 6 hours sitting in a cold chair, my 2 heavy suitcases beside me, as if they were my only companions. And as time passed, I became increasingly invisible. People passed by, glanced, some even whispered. I could feel the gaze of strangers piercing my skin, as if I were a sad scene amidst the hustle and bustle of their lives. Poor thing, she must be lost, they might have thought. But I wasn't lost. I knew exactly where I was. What I lacked was the recognition of who should be there, who promised to be there. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt the humiliation of being forgotten, even after giving your all? Every minute felt like an extra weight on my shoulders. I wondered, had they really forgotten me? Had they turned off their phones on purpose? Could it be that, deep down, I was no longer important? With each passing hour, the answer seemed clearer and more cruel. I wasn't a priority. I was just a detail that could be ignored. This is the most piercing pain. Realizing that those for whom you sacrificed your life, for whom you sacrificed yourself so many times, are the same ones who leave you alone when you need them most. First, I tried to justify it. Maybe it was traffic. Maybe something unexpected. Maybe even a scheduling error. I wanted to believe anything that would make me feel less left out. But by the time the clock struck 5, there were no more excuses to justify my absence. And it was at that moment that the humiliation deepened. Sitting there, surrounded by strangers, I was no longer just a forgotten mother. I was an invisible grandmother, an old woman who seemed to have no value anymore. As I discreetly wiped away my tears, I remembered all the times I'd skipped buying something for myself to pay their bills. All the sleepless nights waiting for a message that never came. All the times I'd been useful, present, needed. And now I was just someone waiting in vain, my heart crushed by a mixture of loneliness and shame. Have you ever felt that? That lump in your throat that wouldn't go away? That feeling of being a burden, of being disposable? The cruelest thing was realizing it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just a delay at the airport. It was a reflection of years of ingratitude, of devaluation, of small signs I insisted on ignoring. The truth is, that scene at the airport was just the culmination of something that had been happening for a long time. And the more I remembered it, the more it hurt. But at the same time, something inside me was beginning to change. Because there is a limit to even the most patient heart, even the most generous soul. On that cold bench, with my body weary and my eyes watering, something ignited inside me. Spark. A reminder that I didn't have to accept that invisible role. I could transform that pain into strength, that abandonment into resolve. And it was there, amidst heavy suitcases and indifferent glances, that my destiny began to change. Because in the midst of that solitude, a courage I never imagined I had was born. And that's where my story really begins. As I sat on that cold airport bench, my mind wasn't just trapped in the 6 hours of abandonment. It took me back, long before that moment, to the days when I believed sacrifice was the only way to show love. It's curious how, in moments of deepest pain, memory insists on taking us back to the scenes of our own history, almost as if it wanted to reveal a hidden truth we've ignored for so long. I saw myself young again, my hands calloused from scrubbing clothes that weren't mine. I remembered the smell of cheap soap, the icy water that burned my skin, and yet I smiled when I returned home carrying fresh bread for my children. That bread felt like the greatest achievement of the day. I'd walk in the door and say, "Eat, my loves, it's warm." They devoured it like a feast, and that was enough to give me the strength to get up the next day and do it all over again. There was a time when I would wake up before dawn and walk miles to work in a wealthy family's house. I cleaned every corner as if it were my own, not out of obligation, but because I knew that at the end of the month, That money would pay the household bills and put food on the table. After hours of work there, I would head to another house, where I would spend the rest of the day. I would return exhausted, but there were still clothes to iron, notebooks to proofread, fevers to manage. It was a routine that seemed endless, but I accepted it because I believed it would all make sense. People said, "You're strong, Margaret, you can handle anything." But the truth is, my strength came from fear. Fear of seeing my children go hungry, fear of failing as a mother, fear of not being enough. And in that fear, I suppressed myself. My desires were always last on the list. I never bought the dress I wanted, I never saved money for myself, I never gave myself the right to stop. My entire journey was built on silent sacrifices, sacrifices that, deep down, I believed would one day be recognized. I remember nights when my eyes burned with sleep, but I still prepared their uniforms and ironed their clothes so they wouldn't be the butt of ridicule at school. I made sure they arrived clean and well-groomed, so no one would think they were the children of a poor woman. And when someone complimented them on how well-mannered they were, I felt a secret pride, as if each compliment were an invisible payment for my pain. And yet, life has a cruel way of showing us that the sacrifices we make don't always earn us gratitude. Looking back, I realize my mindset was one of limitless giving, believing that the more I gave, the more love I would receive in return. But the real impact was different. By denying myself, I taught, without realizing it, that my value was always less than that of others. That I existed to serve, to sustain, to sacrifice. How many times did I skip the table so there would be enough food for them? How many times did I keep the pain inside, hiding my tears so as not to worry anyone? I believed that this was exactly what being a mother was. Carrying the weight alone, smiling on the outside while falling apart on the inside. And the strangest thing is that, at the time, I didn't see it as injustice. I saw it as destiny. But now, sitting in that airport, invisible to those who had promised to pick me up, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all worth it? Was all the fresh bread, every pressed uniform, every extra hour of work, every sleepless night truly appreciated? Or was it that, to them, I was never more than someone who would always be there, no matter how much it cost me? This reflection consumed me, and with it came a bittersweet feeling. Because while it hurt, there was also a spark of clarity. It was as if those memories, painful as they were finally making room for something new. A transformation I hadn't planned, but one that was beginning to emerge within me. And as the indifferent faces passed before me at the airport, I still relived every detail of those years of dedication. It was like watching an intimate film, full of scenes no one else remembered, but which were etched in me with an intensity impossible to erase. And this film wasn't over yet. It was strange to realize how the first signs didn't come suddenly, but in small cracks that I, out of love, tried to ignore. It all began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper hidden in the background of my life as a mother and grandmother. Rebecca and Daniel, my children, no longer came as often. Gone were those unpretentious visits, the simple conversations about the day, the lingering hugs. Their presence seemed conditioned by something. Money. It was as if each call came with a disguised request, and I, out of habit, fear of disappointing, always ended up saying yes. First, I thought it was just a phase. After all, life is hard, youth is full of challenges. They needed support, and I didn't hesitate to give it. But little by little, I noticed a shift in their mindset. Conversations became transactions. Rebecca no longer asked me how I was, but started straight away with, "Mom, I need help paying the electricity bill." Daniel, more cool, said, "You know I don't understand these things, just pay it now, it'll be easier." That hurt me silently but deeply. I wondered, could all the love I'd given have now been reduced to paid bills? The hidden truth slowly revealed itself, as if life wanted to force me to see what I didn't want to see. I tried to find excuses for them. I told myself they were tired, that the rush made them impatient, that today's world hardens people. But deep down I felt the impact of each cutting word. One day when I asked Rebecca about her absence, I heard back, "Mom, you don't understand anything. You just pay the bills and that's it." That sentence pierced me like an invisible knife. It wasn't just ingratitude, it was the erasure of everything I represented. It was at that moment that something inside me began to stir. It was as if each offense, each slight, was pushing my heart into a place of silence. I no longer responded as before. I just withheld it. But within me grew a feeling of emptiness, mixed with indignation. I felt part of a cruel game in which my worth was measured by what I could offer materially, never by who I was. And the most painful thing was that, in public, they feigned normalcy. They made a point of posing as exemplary sons, concerned for their mother, as if they truly cared for me. These were the masks they showed others, while behind the scenes of our relationship, I was merely a source of resources, a burden undeserving of consideration. This duplicity corroded me. There was a gap between what they showed the world and what they truly gave me. And with each passing day, I found myself more trapped in this cycle. I knew I needed to make different decisions, that something inside me was crying out for transformation. But I was still immersed in the foolish hope that everything would go back to the way it was before. That a gesture, an unexpected hug, could prove I was still loved. This hope held me hostage, and I kept giving in, believing in empty promises, until loneliness became routine. The phone only rang when there were bills to pay. Visits were rare and short, always laden with excuses and haste. I waited patiently for a genuine gesture, a kind word, and when none came, I clung to memories of a time when they were still small, when they would run into my arms at the slightest sign of fear or pain. These memories were what kept me going, but at the same time, they were also the painful reminder of all that had been lost. And in this contrast between a past full of sacrifices and a present full of ingratitude, I began to feel a silent revolt. Not the loud, screaming, explosive kind, but a calm revolt, one that builds up and waits for the right moment to emerge. I didn't know it yet, but this build-up would define the course of my journey. Because, in a way, it was as if life was preparing me, slowly revealing an uncomfortable truth, that I would never receive the recognition I so desperately hoped for. And the more I accepted this revelation, the more the pain transformed into something else. It wasn't resignation. It was as if a small, almost imperceptible fire began to burn inside me. A fire that told me I could no longer continue in this invisible role, that I needed to see my own worth outside of what they gave me or didn't give me. That flame was still fragile, but it was enough to make me look back and realize that the first signs of ingratitude weren't just signs. They were a true reflection of what our relationship had become. And as I recalled the cold words, the calculated absences, the requests disguised as affection, I understood that the next step in my journey was inevitable. When I think back to those hours at the airport, I can't help but return to the moment it all began. It was a simple connection, a familiar voice on the phone, that rekindled a flame within me that had almost died out. Rebecca called me with a slight rush in her voice, yet sweet at the same time, as if trying to soothe my insecurities. "Mom, don't worry. We'll pick you up at the airport. Everything's fine." That seemingly ordinary phrase fell over me like a bomb. For a moment, I left behind all the cold words, all the signs of ingratitude, and clung to the promise as if it were proof that there was still room for love. That night, I packed my bags with a care only those who have sacrificed their entire lives understand. Fold by fold, I would pack not just clothes, but pieces of my history. A dress I never wore because I was always busy serving others, a blouse a friend gave me decades ago and treasured, small objects that held memories of a lifetime of sacrifice. Each item was chosen with silent care, as if I were preparing not just for a journey, but for reconciliation. As I packed everything, my heart raced. I thought about what it would be like to see my grandchildren running toward me, like in the movies I watched alone on lonely nights. I imagined Rebecca hugging me tightly, apologizing for being so far away, saying that things would be different now. Even Daniel, even so far away, I imagined arriving unexpectedly, calling me Mom with that voice I still held in the shadows of my memory. This hope was almost a silent prayer, a complete surrender to the possibility of transformation. And with that hope, I dressed with dignity. I chose an outfit that made me feel alive, put on lipstick for the first time in months, and looked in the mirror, trying to see the woman behind the forgotten grandmother. I saw wrinkles, the marks of time, but I also saw strength. I saw an entire journey reflected in a face that had cried a lot, but that still believed in the power of promises. At the airport, my every step felt charged with anticipation. I sat with my bags beside me, and with each glance at the arrival's gate, my heart filled with anticipation. The hours began to pass, but the mindset guiding me at that moment was one of trust. After all, they said they would come. And when we believe in someone, we tend to ignore the clock, forget the discomfort, because hope speaks louder. But as time passed, the hidden truth began to reveal itself. My cell phone didn't ring, my messages went unanswered. I tried to convince myself that there was traffic, that something unexpected had come up. I made excuses in my own mind to protect my children's image, as I had done so many times throughout my life. But each minute without a response was like a widening crack, revealing that the promise that had sustained me so much might be nothing more than another illusion. As I watched families reunite, parents hugging their children, grandparents being welcomed with flowers, I felt a stark contrast to my own reality. The impact was almost physical, like a punch in the gut. It was like watching a show where everyone had their part to play except me. There, alone with 2 heavy suitcases, I began to feel the shadow of humiliation approaching. And yet, there was still a thread of persistent hope within me. Each time the door opened, I took a deep breath, hoping to see a familiar face. Each time it wasn't there, the emptiness grew, but I clung to the repeated promise on the phone. "We'll come get you." It's curious how a single sentence can make or break someone. In my case, it sustained my expectations to the limit, and then crushed my confidence in a way I'll never forget. As the 6th hour approached, there was no longer any way to hide from myself. No traffic jam could last so long, nor any unexpected event that would justify such silence. There, in front of everyone, the mask fell, and I realized the promise was nothing more than a cruel deception. What I had been given as certainty was, in fact, just another chapter in my long journey of invisibility. And in that moment, amidst discreet tears and the weight of loneliness, something began to shift within me. It was as if the abandonment I'd tried to deny had finally revealed itself completely, forcing me to see life without illusions. There was no turning back, because I knew with painful clarity that that promise would not be fulfilled. And this revelation, as bitter as it was necessary, would be the starting point for a transformation I could never have foreseen. The airport clock seemed to mock me. Each hand that moved forward was like a cruel reminder that I was there, forgotten. 1 hour, then 2, 3. Until I lost count of how many times I looked up, hoping to see someone I knew coming toward me. The constant din of announcements, the rush of passengers, families hugging and saying goodbye. Everything seemed to be happening in another dimension, a dimension where I didn't exist. Because that's exactly how I felt. Invisible. I picked up my phone several times, writing short, simple messages, almost begging for a response. "I'm here, are you guys coming? Is everything okay? Are you guys late?" No response. The silence of the lit screen was more painful than any harsh words I'd ever heard. And then when I tried to call, the call went straight to voicemail. It was at that moment that I felt the true impact of the situation. No one was coming. There wasn't even a hint of warning. It was as if my presence didn't matter at all. Meanwhile, the metal bench beneath me felt increasingly cold, and the suitcases beside me grew heavier. They weren't just bags of clothes. They were bags of a lifetime of sacrifice. I felt as if the weight of the past was there, pressing down on my shoulders, reminding me of all the times I'd set aside my own dreams to be present for others. And now, the very ones I'd supported most were making me experience one of the most humiliating experiences of my journey. I looked around and saw happy faces, emotional reunions, long hugs, parents coming to pick up their children, grandchildren running into their grandparents' arms. I was just a spectator in a play that seemed to stage everything I'd been denied. Every smile I saw reminded me of the emptiness I felt. Every hug reminded me of the absence that crushed me. It was as if the whole world were celebrating and I was the only forgotten guest. At times I tried to hide it, fumbling with my bag, looking around as if I were simply waiting calmly. But inside, the lump in my throat grew, and the tears, even when held back, insisted on coming. I held them back as long as I could, because I'd always learned that crying in public was a sign of weakness. But there, in that airport full of strangers, I could no longer control myself. And it was then that I felt the gaze of some curious onlookers resting on me. A look of pity, of judgment. And that look hurt as much as the abandonment itself. It was as if everyone could see the hidden truth I'd been trying to hide. I'd been left behind. And it wasn't just at the airport. It was in life. That scene was just the materialization of what had been happening for years. The neglect, the lack of recognition, the cold shoulder. There, cruelly, was the revelation that I was no longer anyone's priority. The hours dragged on, and with each passing minute my hope diminished. There was no longer any deception, no excuses to justify the silence. The abandonment had become evident. And the pain wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. It was a feeling of emptiness that seemed to swallow me whole. I repeated to myself. It felt like I no longer existed. And this phrase echoed like a dark mantra. Yet, amidst this darkness, something began to stir within me. It was a mixture of indignation and clarity. A silent, almost imperceptible transformation, but one that grew stronger with each passing second. Because if I no longer existed for them, perhaps the time had come for me to exist for myself. This idea was still vague, embryonic, but it already brought me a spark of strength. As the clock struck the 6th hour, I realized I was at an invisible crossroads. I could stay there, waiting, nurturing a hope that only destroyed me, or I could make a decision that would change everything. I didn't yet know what the next step would be, but I felt that this painful wait was about to transform into something greater. Because in the cruelest silence, the most unexpected courage is born. On that cold airport bench, with my body tired and my heart crushed by the silence, I began to travel inward. It was as if the pain of that abandonment had opened a door to memories I'd tried to keep closed. And suddenly, I found myself back home, sitting by the window, looking out at the street as I had so often done before. That window was my waiting platform, my vigil. How many entire afternoons I spent there, waiting for the phone to ring, for someone to remember me, for an unexpected visit to break the weight of loneliness. But the phone almost never rang. And when it did, it was only to ask for something, never to check on me. This silence was deafening. With each day without news, I felt as if my existence faded a little further. I looked outside and saw people going about their lives, couples holding hands, neighbors carrying bags, children playing on the sidewalk. And I, inside, was like a shadow, someone the world had forgotten. Sometimes I held the phone in my hands, as if the mere touch of that object could draw attention, as if it could somehow connect me to the rest of my life. But nothing happened. And when a call finally came, it was only to ask for financial help or solve some practical problem. Never to hear my voice out of longing. It was in these moments that the crying came, silent, without screams, without laments. Just tears flowing slowly, heavy, carrying years of accumulated feelings. I hid them even from myself, wiping them away quickly so as not to leave marks. I'd learned throughout my life to be strong, to not show weakness. But there, alone, with no one to see, vulnerability took over. And it was that same crying that accompanied me at the airport. Contained, discreet tears that fell as if they were the exact expression of my invisibility. There was a hidden truth in those moments, that even when surrounded by people, I always felt alone. Because loneliness isn't just the absence of company, but the absence of importance in the lives of those you love. And this realization was incredibly painful. I constantly wondered, did they ever truly see me? Or was I always just the backdrop, the guaranteed presence who served but was never appreciated? For many years, I accepted this as a natural part of a mother's journey. I believed that giving oneself completely was proof of love. But as I remembered the window and the silent phone, I realized there was something wrong with this logic. Because loving shouldn't mean disappearing. It shouldn't mean annulling oneself until becoming invisible. This revelation hit me like a lightning bolt, and as painful as it was, it also had a liberating impact. It was as if I was finally beginning to see the hidden plot behind the scenes of my own story. And even though the pain was almost unbearable, there was also a strange sense of clarity. As if each tear was washing away the fog that had blocked my vision of reality. I understood, in that heavy silence, that waiting forever for recognition was condemning myself to frustration. It was like waiting for a disconnected phone to ring. And this realization, however bitter, was the beginning of a transformation. At the airport, reliving all those scenes, I realized that the vulnerability I'd hidden so much was actually part of me. And there was no shame in feeling, in crying, in admitting that I, too, had limits. Because being strong all the time had cost me dearly. It had robbed me of the chance to be cared for, to be seen, to simply be human. And perhaps that was exactly where my greatest truth lay. As I watched the people pass before me, I realized it wasn't just loneliness that hurt me, but the feeling that I had no voice, that my story didn't matter. And yet, within me, there was a narrative pulsing, full of revelations, full of unmade decisions, full of possibilities still waiting to be revealed. This journey of pain was showing me that vulnerability, far from being weakness, could be the starting point for something greater. And it was with this awareness, even amidst the quiet tears and deafening silence, that I began to understand that this weight, cruel as it was taking me to a place I never imagined. Because deep down, I knew something was about to change, and that change had already begun within me, even if I didn't yet have the courage to admit it out loud. As I relived all of this within myself, sitting on that cold airport bench, I realized this wasn't just my story. How many other women, how many other men have felt forgotten, cast aside by those they loved most? How many times have you waited for a gesture that never arrived, for a call that never came, for a word that would have changed everything? If anything I've shared so far has touched a nerve, if any part of this truth resonates with you, please leave it in the comments. I really want to read what you've been holding on to, because I know that when we share our experiences, we not only heal a little, but also help others not feel alone on this journey. And if you felt outrage, if at any point it hurt you as much as it hurt me, like this video, this simple gesture helps this message reach more people who need to hear that they're not alone. Your participation is what keeps this space alive. It's what ensures that stories like mine don't get lost in silence. And if you believe it's important to continue bringing these hidden truths to light, these revelations that are so often hidden behind the scenes of life, subscribe to the channel. This way you'll join me on this journey and ensure that new stories, full of impact and transformation, reach you. With every comment, every like, every subscription, you help build a community of people who aren't afraid to look within and acknowledge their own pain. Because, deep down, we all need to feel like we're part of something bigger, that our voices matter, that our experiences can resonate and touch other lives. And that's exactly what we're building here. So, if anything in this story has ever revolted or moved you, share it. This space is ours, it's yours. It belongs to those who carry memories that can no longer be silenced. And as I reflect on all this, I realize that the weight of loneliness I experienced in that airport wasn't just mine. It was a reflection of so many other lives, so many other stories intersecting in this same feeling of invisibility. And it was in this understanding that something began to transform within me, as if vulnerability had become the seed of a new strength I couldn't yet explain. After 6 hours sitting on that metal bench, my eyes burning from searching for faces that never came and my heart crushed by the silence, something inside me finally broke. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a gesture of despair. It was a silent decision, but so powerful that it completely changed the direction of my life. I looked at the clock once more and, for the first time in that cruel wait, I understood that no one would come. There was no traffic that could justify it, no excuse that could erase the impact of that abandonment. There, before so many families reuniting, I understood that the promise I'd received was nothing more than empty words. It was at that moment that a transformation began to take place. I stood up slowly, as if the weight that had kept me tied to the bench had suddenly dissolved. I picked up my bags, which until then had felt heavier than my own soul, and walked to the ticket counter. I had money saved, savings I'd accumulated over the years for emergencies, for unexpected situations. And if that wasn't an emergency, then what was? But more than a practical decision, that purchase represented something bigger. It was the first time in a long time that I was choosing for myself, not for them. As the attendant entered my information into the computer, I felt a strange force coursing through me, a mixture of fear and freedom. I wasn't just buying a plane ticket. I was buying the chance to rewrite my journey, to break free from the role of silent victim and take control of my own story. For the first time, I stopped thinking about what they would say, what they would expect of me. I thought only about what I needed. And what I needed was a new life, far from the invisible chains that kept me trapped in ingratitude. When I received the ticket, I felt a shiver run through me. It was as if that piece of paper held revelations I couldn't yet fully grasp, but which already heralded an inevitable change. I sat down again, but this time the wait had a different flavor. I was no longer staring at the arrival's door, waiting for someone who would never arrive. I was looking to the future, to a destiny that, for the first time in years, I had chosen myself. And it was at that moment that an even deeper decision formed within me. If they had the courage to forget me for 6 hours, if they were capable of rendering me invisible to so many, then I also had the right to forget. To forget the bills I'd always paid for them, to forget the favors that were never acknowledged, to forget the role of provider that turned me into a hostage. I silently told myself, if they've forgotten me, I'll forget to pay their bills too. And that sentence wasn't just a rant. It was a manifesto, a moral and financial turning point, a symbolic break with the dependence they themselves created. Suddenly, that abandonment that had once seemed like the end to me became a new beginning. I realized that the pain that had crushed me also fueled me to move in a different direction. It was as if life had placed me before a cruel mirror, and instead of retreating, I finally had the courage to look at the reflection. And in the reflection, I saw someone who still had value, someone who could still make decisions, someone who no longer needed to live only in the background of other people's lives. With each breath, clarity grew. I no longer felt just sadness, there was also indignation, and along with it, an unexpected freedom. That plane ticket wasn't just a ticket. It was a symbol that I still had a choice. And perhaps the greatest revelation of all was this. It wasn't too late. I could still change my destiny, even after so many years of being forgotten. As I watched the hustle and bustle of the airport, I realized how different everything seemed. The families embracing no longer caused me the same pain, but rather a kind of necessary distance. I no longer needed to envy what I didn't have, because now I had something far more valuable. The knowledge that I no longer depended on their recognition to exist. I could exist on my own. And so, clutching that note tightly in my hands, I felt that the journey that was beginning to unfold would be far greater than I could have imagined. It was as if life was telling me that sometimes abandonment is just the gateway to profound transformation. I still didn't know what the future held, but I no longer had any doubt that I was ready to move on, even if alone. Because, deep down, I was no longer the same woman who had arrived at that airport. When the plane landed in another city, I felt as if I'd left a part of myself behind. It wasn't just the bags I was carrying, but decades of memories, pain, and silence that I now chose to place elsewhere. As I descended and felt the wind blow on my face, I realized something else had also landed within me. A new mindset. It was as if life had forcibly ripped me from a scene of humiliation to place me on a different path, where I would finally have the right to exist without having to ask permission. In the lobby, a familiar figure appeared, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. It was Evelyn, my childhood friend. We hadn't seen each other in years, but her embrace seemed to stitch together all my open wounds in seconds. "I knew you needed me," she said, and those words echoed like a bomb. Because that's exactly what it was. I needed someone to remind me there was still room for me in this world. Not the space of obligation, nor the space of demands, but the space of true affection, of selfless care, of the simple pleasure of being together. Evelyn took me to her home, a simple house but full of life. In the backyard, colorful flowers scattered as if dancing in the wind. And in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee invaded every corner. There, I wasn't a burden, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the woman forgotten at the airport. There I was, Margaret. That was all. And that was enough. That night, lying in a bed that wasn't mine but welcomed me as if it were, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. I didn't have to pay anything to be there. I didn't have to justify my presence. I didn't have to hide my tears. Could simply be. And it was in that welcoming silence that I understood something greater. God never closes a door without opening another. The airport door had closed cruelly, with a bang of abandonment and humiliation, but now a new door opened before me, one of dignity and a new beginning. The next day, I walked to the town square with Evelyn. People waved to her, and by extension to me. I felt included again, as if I wasn't just a shadow. It was in that moment that I realized my journey wasn't just about pain, but also about revelations. I'd spent so long believing my destiny was tied to my children that I'd forgotten my life was my own. And there, amidst unfamiliar faces, I felt I could rebuild my path. This transformation didn't happen overnight. There were still wounds, heavy memories, voices that insisted on reminding me of abandonment. But there was also something new. A sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied down by bills that weren't mine, by responsibilities that crushed me, by decisions that never included me. I had made a decision for myself, and that decision had changed everything. As I helped Evelyn prepare lunch, I realized the impact of this choice. I was no longer just surviving, I was living. I found pleasure in peeling vegetables, listening to an old song on the radio, feeling the sun streaming through the window. These were simple things but charged with meaning. Behind the scenes of everyday life, I rediscovered the value I had forgotten in myself. And it wasn't long before thoughts of my children returned. Not with the same weight as before, but with a different clarity. I knew their abandonment would not go unnoticed by life. Because there is a law that never fails, an inevitable return that shows each person the consequences of their choices. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to raise my voice. The simple fact that I was standing rebuilding my story was in itself an answer. Evelyn told me something I'll never forget. Sometimes what feels like the end is just the revelation of a new beginning. And I understood. The airport had been my breaking point but also my turning point. And now, sitting on that simple porch, smelling of wet earth after the rain, I knew the new beginning had begun. But there was something inside me that still burned. It wasn't just the pain of the past, but the knowledge that, at some point, fate would bring me face to face with the people who had forgotten me. And when that happened, I would no longer be the same woman who waited 6 hours on a cold bench. I would be someone else. The days I spent at Evelyn's house passed in a flash, but something inside me had already changed irreversibly. I felt a peace I no longer remembered. Each morning felt like a silent invitation to begin again, and every detail, the fresh coffee, the birdsong, even the sound of conversations on the street, reminded me that there was still life within me, that I could still choose. But fate, as it always does, had its own revelation in store, and it was not long in coming. It was a gray afternoon, while I was helping Evelyn fold freshly washed clothes, that the phone rang. The number, even before I answered, brought a pang to my chest. It was Rebecca. For a moment I considered not answering. But something inside me, perhaps curiosity or even a need to close a circle, made me swipe the screen and hear that voice on the other end. Only this time, the voice held no sweetness, no promises. Held despair. "Mom, the rent is late, we need your money. You have to help, or we'll lose everything." Her words came quickly, almost in a rush. There was no longing in her tone, no concern for where I was or how I felt. There was only an urgency to wrest from me what I had given up for so many years with my eyes closed. My effort, my sacrifice, my money. I took a deep breath. For a moment, I saw my entire journey flash before my eyes like a movie. The years of hard work, the silent laundry, the lovingly ironed uniforms, the sleepless nights, the window wait, the cold airport bench, the cruel abandonment. And along with these memories came a clarity I had never allowed to blossom before. The hidden truth was finally before me, naked and impossible to ignore. They didn't see me as a mother, they saw me as a support, a crutch, an inexhaustible source. That feeling of indignation I'd so often kept silent now found a voice. And it was a firm, calm, but unshakable voice. I said, "You lost your motherly care when you decided to leave me alone. Now, each of you pays your own bills." The silence on the other end was heavy. Rebecca took a few seconds to respond, and I could almost hear the shock crossing the line. Perhaps she never imagined she'd hear something like this from me. Because throughout my life my attitude had always been one of surrender, of acceptance, of doing more for others than for myself. But that Margaret was no more. The woman speaking now was the fruit of a profound transformation, a decision born not of resentment, but of the need to survive with dignity. Rebecca tried to argue, tried to repeat the same phrases that had worked so often for me. "Mom, you don't understand, it's just this once, we have no one but you." But I was no longer held hostage by those words. I did understand. I understood that every time I said yes, I faded a little more. I understood that every time I gave in, I reinforced their mentality that I would always be available, even if it cost me everything. And for the first time, I decided that wouldn't be the case anymore. As she spoke, I realized there was no room for guilt. Because what I was doing wasn't abandonment. It was justice. It was returning to each person the responsibility that was always theirs. It was, in short, letting the law of life do its work. This wasn't revenge. It was liberation. The impact of this decision was immediate within me. I hung up the phone with steady hands, my heart racing, but my soul light. There was no regret. There was a sense of revelation, that I had finally found my own voice after so many years of silence. And this voice told me that I too had the right to be cared for, to be respected, to live for myself. As I looked out Evelyn's window, I saw children running down the street and remembered my grandchildren. I felt a tightness in my chest, because their distance was perhaps the hardest part of all this. But I also understood that I could no longer carry the weight of their parents' ingratitude alone. Because every journey must be lived responsibly, and I had already done my part. And it was at that moment, looking at that world in motion, that I realized that life still had encounters in store for me, perhaps even reunions. But if that ever happened, I would no longer be the woman forgotten at the airport. I would be someone else. After that call with Rebecca, I stood motionless for a few minutes, staring at the phone as if it could still tell me something. But what needed to be said had already been said, and it wasn't words. It was the decision that came out of my mouth firmly. A revelation that surprised not only my daughter but myself as well. It was in that moment that I understood, viscerally, the impact of a choice. A single decision can be the turning point between remaining a prisoner of the past or making room for a real life. As I walked through Evelyn's simple living room, I felt the power of that moment growing within me. It was as if I had finally broken an invisible chain that had bound me for years. And the clarity that came afterward was almost spiritual. I understood that life doesn't just hand us pointless pain, but hidden lessons, hidden truths that reveal themselves when we can no longer ignore them. Mine right there was clear. I had lived so long trying to be everything to others that I had forgotten how to be someone to myself. I looked out the window and saw the quiet street, the children laughing at simple things, and I realized how happiness can be hidden behind the scenes of life. Hidden in the details that require nothing more than our presence. It wasn't about great achievements, titles, or recognition. It was about dignity. It was about allowing yourself to exist without needing to beg for attention. It was about cultivating what truly matters. With each passing day, the mindset that once held me hostage to guilt and obligations began to dissolve. I learned to get up early and make coffee not because someone depended on me, but because I wanted to feel the warm aroma filling the house. I discovered the pleasure of sitting calmly at the table, of opening a book without rushing, of writing thoughts in a notebook as if I were talking to myself. Small revelations that showed me that, even after so long living for others, it was still possible to start over. And deep down there was a certainty I couldn't ignore. Life always gives back. not in the way we expect, but in the way we need. I no longer held a grudge, but I understood that every abandonment, every harsh word, every absence they sowed would, sooner or later, return as loneliness. This is the silent law that governs everyone's journey. Those who sow neglect reap emptiness. But those who sow dignity, sooner or later, reap peace. And it was in this awareness that I found myself reflected. With each reflection, I remembered the faces of the people who crossed my path, some bearing wounds, others bringing healing. I realized that the abandonment at the airport wasn't just a cruel scene. It was also a mirror, showing me who I was, but most importantly, who I no longer wanted to be. I no longer wanted to be the woman who waits eternally, who silences her pain so as not to disturb. I wanted to be the woman who looks at herself with respect, who understands that each tear she shed was also a step toward a new version of myself. And it was in this spirit that, one morning, I sat on Evelyn's porch, closed my eyes, and let the words emerge from within, like a nameless prayer, like an intimate conversation with life. Life has taught me that those who sow abandonment reap loneliness, but those who sow dignity reap peace. As I said it quietly, I realized it wasn't just a pretty phrase. It was the sum total of everything I'd experienced. It was a revelation that applied not just to me, but to anyone who's ever felt invisible, who's ever carried the weight of ingratitude, who's ever been cast aside when I needed it most. And perhaps that's why I feel the need to share this lesson, because I know it's not just mine. It belongs to all of us who have waited for a hug that never came, who have remained silent in the face of unfair words, who have carried more than we could bear. This story is a personal journey, but it's also a collective reflection. And if it has reached you in some way, it's because, deep down, our pains connect. As I let those words echo within me, I felt my story wasn't over yet. On the contrary, it was just beginning. Because when we learn to cultivate dignity, destiny inevitably begins to return what, for so long, seemed denied. And I could already sense that there was something more waiting for me, as if life was preparing the next chapter of this journey. If you've stuck with me this far, you already know that this story isn't just about me, but about all of us who carry silent scars and learn, often through pain, to see our own worth. So, I want to invite you to continue being a part of this journey. If this message spoke to you in any way, touched a memory, or brought a revelation about your own journey, leave a comment with the phrase, "This message was for me." I'll know that you were with me until the end and that, somehow, our stories connected. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories I bring you with such care. Each video here is designed to spark reflection, connection, and perhaps a new perspective on life. Your subscription is what helps me continue sharing and transforming these experiences into something that can also strengthen you. And, of course, if this video touched you, if you felt a connection, please leave a like. This simple gesture helps show YouTube that this content has impact and should reach more people who, like you, need to hear something like this. And since you've made it this far, don't stop now. There's a video right here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there.